Welcome back, everybody. Well, after a couple of day hiatus, we are back at it with parts 3 and 4 of Extra History's Kursk. And today we're getting into Operation Citadel, which was the German plan for an offensive against the Soviets to try and bring in a pincer from the north and the south to cut off that Kursk salient, which was that bulge in the line. In and around Kursk. And this is a huge battle. The Germans are actually outnumbered something like 2 or 3 to 1. There's a total of something like 8,000 tanks involved in this battle. It's just ridiculously huge. And by the time it's over, it lasts about a week and a half. The Germans had lost, but they had inflicted like 5 to 1 casualties on the Soviets. But this just goes to show you just how massive the manpower was on the Soviet side, that they could suffer 5 to 1 casualties, win the battle, and still follow that up by going on a permanent offensive at that point. So it'll be interesting to see. I don't know a lot about the battle itself, the battles for Kursk. Just what I've just kind of shared with you and what I've read here and there over time. So I'll be curious to see what we can learn today.
Days, weeks passed. The men on the front line waited for the inevitable, for the unthinkable, for the cataclysmic conflict that had to come around the salient at Kursk. Then it happened. One night, the soldiers of the Wehrmacht were given a special ration of schnapps, a sign every man knew. Liquor to steal the soul, a last drink before you die. One man deserts. He heads to the Soviet line, and he's interrogated for hours. At last, he convinces a political officer on the scene, a man named Nikita Khrushchev, that he's telling the truth.
So I want to talk about Khrushchev for just a second, because I think I mentioned in one of the first 2 episodes that Khrushchev was at Stalingrad, which he was. However, I also may have mentioned that he was in charge at Stalingrad, which he's not. He was a political commissar, so he's a political officer. He did have the rank of lieutenant general during World War II. But yeah, he wasn't a general, leading large armies in the battlefield. He was a commissar. He was a political officer. He was there for morale. He was there to make sure everybody's doing what they're supposed to be doing. Things of that nature. But I believe Marshal Zhukov was actually the guy in charge here for the Soviets.
That the attack will begin on July the 5th, the next day. Khrushchev calls Moscow in the middle of the night. Joseph Stalin is woken up. He asks Khrushchev for his assessment, to which Khrushchev replies, "We will make the enemy pay in blood."
So 2 things I want to point out there that are interesting about that. Number 1, they call and they wake up Stalin in the middle of the night, something that probably would not have happened on the German side. And then Stalin asks Khrushchev for his assessment. So you get the sense that, wow, Stalin, I'm not trying to defend Stalin as being this stand-up guy, because we know he wasn't. But it seems, at least in this case, that he was not quite as to be feared as Hitler was when it came to don't wake him up, things like that. And Stalin was at least willing to be notified of these things and to give some latitude to his generals on how to deal with it.
Then the Soviet guns begin to sing. All along the front, in the pre-dawn hours of July 5th, 1943, Soviet artillery attempts to disrupt German units forming up for the upcoming assault. The effect is limited. The Wehrmacht have been planning for this day for too long. But Stalin and his greatest general, Zhukov, had not been idle either. They had turned the Kursk salient into a fortress. Observations along the frontier and intelligence supplied by the British made it all too clear that this is exactly where a German attack would come. At first, Stalin wanted to preempt the attack by an offensive of his own, but Zhukov eventually convinced him instead to build the greatest defensive works of the Eastern Front and let the Germans wade through their own dead to try to make it through. Once they'd been bloodied here, there'd be time enough for an offensive.
And this is a brilliant decision on Zhukov's part to say, you know what? Yeah, we're going to go on the offensive, but let's let them deplete their manpower first. Let's build a defensive alignment, let them come at us, and then when they're weak, we will counterattack. It's brilliant, and it's exactly the way to handle this situation.
And as the cannons roared and dawn broke, the great test finally came. The Luftwaffe took to the air, not for once as a force meant to cripple the enemy's air capacity, but rather simply as support for the massive assault. Bombs fell on artillery and bunkers rather than airfields. The Germans knew the air war couldn't be sustained. Still, the Soviet Air Force managed at first a haphazard response, and in the opening waves, large numbers of Yakovlev and Lavochkin fighters fell from the sky. On the northeast, the German advance rolled forward, slowed by the vast minefields of the salient. New technology was tried. They deployed an innovation, a remote-controlled mine-sweeping vehicle. It was instantly met with fire from the Soviet artillery. Bursting shells and mines exploding under fire turned the battlefield into a haze of smoke and suspended earth.
Man.
But the path was clear, at least at first, and the forces on the left pushed on. The far left, armed with the rare Ferdinand, an 88 mounted on a rejected version of the Tiger chassis, found itself struggling as the fighting devolved into fierce close-quarters combat. Their Ferdinand, their armed support, didn't have any close-quarters weapons. It was devoid of even the machine gun that was standard on most tanks.
So you got to wonder what they were thinking there, unless they were expecting that it was going to have infantry support nearby to provide that kind of support. But it sounds like they just kind of threw this thing out there without really, and it's unusual for the Germans, because usually the Germans kind of thought this stuff through, and they just didn't throw things out there willy-nilly like that. But there's got to be a reason why they were willing to deploy these things without having 50 caliber machine guns or something else with it to support it.
Losses began to mount, and yet still they pushed on. In the center of the northern push, the new Tiger tanks started to show their mettle against the Soviet T-34, the tank that had been causing German armor so much trouble for years, and they began to push through. Gains were made, but everywhere they were stopped short of a true breakthrough. Luftwaffe and Red Air Force fighters traded turns strafing the ground, and the massive concentration of artillery from both sides continued non-stop. By late afternoon, it was clear that this was going to be no rush across France. All along the north, the Germans were slowly carving their way into the enemy lines, but behind every minefield they crossed, and every pillbox they shattered, there was just another minefield, another pillbox awaiting them.
Imagine what that does to your morale. Okay, we're finally through the minefield. We're finally past the outer layer of defenses, and there's another layer. You get through that one, and there's another layer. It just seems like it never ends. At what point does your psyche begin to weigh on you? At what point does this start to cause you to doubt your ability and to doubt that it's ever going to get better? It had to have been incredibly frustrating for the Germans.
In Zhukov's fortress, Kursk, and casualties were beginning to mount. Even though much of the remaining German resources had been devoted for months to the offensive around Kursk, German reserves were at an all-time low. Partisan activity behind the lines further hampered men and material from reaching the front, and the variety of vehicles and the introduction of new and radical tank designs strained repair crews to their limits. Meanwhile, in the south, Manstein's force began to execute a similar plan, brutal in its simplicity. Push forward. He had concentrated his forces in the center of his front, and planned to simply exert force at a point until the Soviets broke. He had some of the strongest panzer divisions left to the German army, and they would act like a spearhead to thrust through the Soviet line. His initial target was the small town of Obayan, a mere 30 miles from the front. But this attack began in stinging rain, which softened the ground and slowed operations.
And weather continues to play a factor. I mean, think back to D-Day and all of the ways in which the weather impacted even the start date of that operation. You have to wonder if there was some talk of maybe holding off on this attack until the weather could be dealt with. But obviously that was not what they chose to do.
Even the following day, when the weather cleared, the muddy terrain hampered the advance. But with the clear weather came the war in the air. The Red Air Force thought that here they might surprise the Germans and catch their planes still on the ground, but the Luftwaffe scrambled just in time, and what initially appeared to be a turkey shoot for the Soviets turned into a massive battle in the sky. Over 400 planes whirled and chased along the 20 miles of the front. Underneath, hundreds of Panthers and Panzer IIIs and IVs and self-propelled guns rolled along a 2-mile stretch of open front. But even that wasn't enough. Slowed by weather and entangled in the Soviet defenses, the presence of so many tanks just didn't scatter the Soviet units like they would have 2 years before. Instead, they were met with the near-suicidal resistance of the Soviet Guard. Men would leap on tanks to take out their turrets with satchel charges, or face down panzers moving at full speed with anti-tank rifles.
And this goes to show you where those casualty figures come from. This is why it's those kinds of tactics, while incredibly heroic and brave and effective, but why the Soviets suffered 5 times as many casualties in this battle as the Germans did. And if the numbers had been more even, that might have made a difference, but the Germans were outnumbered 3-1, so even inflicting 5-1 casualties, there's just too many of them.
But the Germans did still have the practiced killers of the SS Panzer Corps to throw at the south. The powerful Tigers destroyed bunkers from half a mile away, only to be met with the withering hail of Katyusha rockets. Flamethrower teams burnt their way forward, cooking men alive at their guns. It was a scene from hell. Rapidly, the Germans smashed through the front line, but this was resistance on a scale totally unlike what they'd expected. By the early morning hours of the next day, the Germans had barely reached the second line of Soviet defenses. Of the 3 major groups in the south, only one made it to its nominal first-day objective, and one was woefully behind. Soviet artillery took out bridge after bridge on the Donets, further hampering the advance. On both fronts, north and south, the Germans were making gains. Nowhere had they simply been repulsed or forced to reverse or retreat, and yet nowhere had they made a breakthrough either. Almost every contingent of the German forces was behind schedule, off the timetable of the initial planning.
And you have to... I don't know, I'm just kind of thinking out loud here, but this is 1943. So this is about the time, July 1943, this is right around the time that the Allies are invading Italy. So this is all kind of going on at the same time. You have to think that it would have been the better part of wisdom on the part of the Germans to have built their own defensive fortifications and tried to hold the Soviet advance instead of trying to advance through all of these layers of defensive positions and minefields and tanks and, just deplete their already depleted manpower when they could have been trying to do the same to the Soviets and let the Soviets bleed themselves dry, hurling wave after wave into the Germans, because they're also trying to defend down in Sicily, and by this point Africa is pretty well done, but I don't know, it just doesn't seem like the way to go.
And yet the cost had been immense, for both sides. As the first few days of Operation Citadel wound down, the fate of the contest stood on a knife's edge. Neither side was winning, but neither side could be said to have started to lose. And on that knife's edge hung the fate of nations, if not the world. Hitler knew full well that a victory here wouldn't win him the war, but if he could win here and inflict major losses on the Soviet forces, it was possible that he might be able to sit down with the Soviet ambassadors and bargain for peace from a position of strength. A successful conclusion here might at least temporarily allow a cessation of the war in the East, so that German forces could be concentrated on the imminent war in the West. With Great Britain and the United States looking to finally truly push into Europe, a victory here might be able to cut them off from their ferocious Eastern ally. And in turn, a loss here would mean disaster. It would encourage the democracies in the West to hasten their invasion of Europe, if for no other reason than to prevent Stalin from capturing more European territory than they'd ever want him to have. It would mean the loss of some of the best remaining units in the Reich, and destabilize a front that they could barely hold as it is. Join us next time as we watch which way the knife edge falls in this pivotal battle for the Eastern Front.
So a couple of closing thoughts about this. Some folks commented after the last episode that, hey, Kursk was not actually the largest tank battle of the war. And honestly, that really just comes down to how you define a battle. Was this all one battle? If so, it's by far the largest tank battle in history, and there's really no comparison. Or, was what was going on the southern flank a different battle than what was going on the north, and it was all part of this larger Operation Citadel? Then you can kind of argue that maybe individually. I mean, we're not talking about 8,000 tanks all on one battlefield, all looking at each other in a couple of mile front. We're talking about hundreds of miles of territory over which this battle was fought. So it's not a battle in the sense that the Battle of Gettysburg was a battle, or the Battle of Waterloo was a battle, where everybody's in one battlefield. This is spread out over a large area, but it's all happening at the same time, and it's all part of the same movement of troops. Battle of the Bulge is the same way. This is a big, massive area. So that, a lot of those discrepancies when you see people claiming, oh, that's not the largest tank battle, that's not this, that's not that. It really comes down to how you interpret things, how you define things. And that's true for a lot of the things that we talk about when it comes to these wars. So let me know your thoughts about Operation Citadel and about what we've discussed. Like I said at the beginning of episode 1, the Eastern Front is not an area of expertise for me. So I'm largely kind of throwing in the little bits that I do know and then just reacting to what's happening. So I would love to hear your thoughts about the same things. Don't forget to hit that like button. Please subscribe if you haven't already. And we'll be back tomorrow with part 4. Thanks for watching.